Good morning, everyone. My name is Ray Epstein, and I'm an ambassador here at No More, as well as the founder and president of Student Activists Against Sexual Assault on my campus in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the Temple University. Thank you, everyone, so much for tuning in. And Nicole, thank you so much for being here with us, especially for today's session, From Harm to Hope, exploring the intersection of technology and domestic violence. Joining us today is Dame Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. Since her appointment in the role in September of 2019, Nicole has put her 30 plus years of experience in domestic abuse policy and intervention to work, driving improvements to transform the response to domestic abuse in England and Wales. She is committed to championing victims and survivors of all ages, statuses, and backgrounds, as well as shining a light on the practices that fail them. So, Nicole, you have been the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales since 2019. To start, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, as well as what your role entails and what led you to this position?
Sure. It's great to be here, Ray. And it's wonderful to be talking to you in particular because of your background and being in Philadelphia. Because if I were describing some of what brought me into this work, it was an internship I did when I was in my last year of college in the US. I was in the Midwest at a very small college, liberal arts college, and I did an internship in Philadelphia, and I was very interested in law at the time. I was interested in I think I was interested broadly in human rights. I'm very interested in politics in general. And I did an internship in two places in Philadelphia. One was the National Organization for Women, and also at a rape crisis organization, which took me to court supporting children. And one of the things that I realized very, very quickly, sadly, was that most of the perpetrators of the rape and sexual violence of the children I was there to support kind of through their day in court were known to them. They were usually maybe a family member, the mom's boyfriend, something along those lines. And it was as a young, 20, well, I think I was just turning 21 at the time, that definitely is what brought me kind of squarely into this world, because I became intensely interested in trying to kind of address and support and fix some of these problems I was seeing that were quite startling to me. And since doing the kind of very quick trajectory through the next 30 years that you describe is in my introduction, I did just literally kind of from that point on go from one job to another that was following that interest, which was at first a state coalition against domestic violence, then moving over to London, continuing in quite a lot of initiatives that related to working with the police, working on health sites, working in frontline domestic abuse services over many years. And I became really interested in the concept of more systemic change. So the difference between helping one person versus fixing or addressing problems in systems, which seem to be happening over and over and over. And I became very interested in that idea. How do you fix kind of or redesign systems that are meant to be helping victims, which often don't? And how do you get that right? And eventually in 2019, very late in 2019, I was appointed to this role. And I can explain a little bit about that if you'd like. But it's
Oh,
okay. It's a public appointees role. So I know this is an international audience, but for here in the UK, I'm not a government minister, but I've been asked by government to take on this role. And I've been in the role itself was established in a piece of legislation called the Domestic Abuse Act. And it gives my role a couple of powers. So I'm able to seek information from public bodies to really gather information to kind of drive progress, essentially. And here in the UK, public bodies is defined in the legislation, but it means all of the public services that you would expect, and also government. And I'm able to make recommendations that have to be responded to within 56 days. So the whole idea of my role and the role of my team here at the Commissioner's Office is to kind of keep that momentum for change moving, and having those powers helps kind of move things along more quickly.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that you started off more in direct victim services. I think a lot of people who initially enter this field are more focused on individual experience and addressing one by one, but there's sort of this pipeline as you continue to see how frequent it is that you feel you have to move into the broader space and to affecting future change. So it's amazing that you're in this position where people have to respond and have an obligation, and there's that
Yeah,
sense of accountability.
yeah.
So at last year's tech conference, you spoke about the Online Safety Act, which was still in the early stages at that time. But over the past year, can you talk a little bit about what impact this legislation has had, particularly in supporting survivors?
Yeah, it's really interesting to watch a piece of legislation that will have such an international impact. So um, a lot of times, like the Domestic Abuse Act I just explained that created my role, it's quite, I mean, there's a lot to learn from country to country, but it's fairly localized in terms of the impact. But because tech companies are so international, our Online Safety Act um, is interesting to see how much it takes to mobilize and implement. So in a way, I could say lots has happened in the last year, but we're still at the point where the regulator called Ofcom is still on the verge of actually regulating. So it's not. We're not at that point quite yet. I think it's happening in the coming months where the regulator will kind of go online literally. Right now, there's been in the last year quite a lot of work in relation to bringing evidence and guidance together, sometimes thousands of pages long, because the Ofcom is very focused on wanting to be an evidence-based regulator, making sure that and also consulting with the public, consulting with industry about the regulation. So that is all coming, and I think it's probably fair to say that um, that technology companies, online platforms are all paying a lot of attention, and probably, I would hope that the fact that the regulation is coming soon means that they have been planning for that. But it is still true that we're kind of in mid-process. So even just this week, for example, the regulators publishing some guidance on violence against women and girls in particular. So you all may remember some of the variant the debates in our Online Safety Act covered obviously harms that are unlawful, like harms to children. But then there was a lot of debate about how far the regulator ought to go in relation to violence against women and girls. Some things that are what they call legal but harmful, and so our legislation didn't cover those types of things. There's more guidance issued in relation to those things. So it's if I were, the honest answer is it's early days in terms of is that going far enough?
Of course. So beyond the Online Safety Act, are there any other significant developments in the past year that you've been working on, or any upcoming legislative changes that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, I am. I mean, to be truthfully, I'm very excited about the work that Ofcom is doing and the kind of online safety potential that we might have. I think we're a long way to go in terms of making sure the police or our support systems, victims don't live their whole life online. They are on and offline. They're reporting these things. And there's this kind of whole surrounding realm of issues that are more tech facilitated abuse, the kind of tracking tools, things that we need to build the safety by design into. So I suppose I am heartened by how much those kinds of things are progressing. They're emerging is important. Again, should we have been doing this from the start? Yes, we should have, but we now have these opportunities in legislation, but also the surrounding kind of environment that it creates to address those. I would say the largest thing in the UK that's happened in the last year is we've had a change in government. So we've gone from a Tory-led government to a Labour government. So that's we hadn't had that in 14 years here in the UK. So that's been a big change. And we have a government now who's committed to one of its key missions of government is having violence against women and girls in a decade, which people here debate a lot about. Is that a smart thing to have for a government to say that they will do? Is it naive? There's sadly quite a lot of violence against women and girls. That's quite a commitment to make. But I really relish it because I think, well, that gives us so much opportunity for government to say, this is really important to us. We're going to put our political kind of reputation on the line. This is one of our key commitments. And we're right now waiting for the kind of almost like the blueprint for this kind of, what is it that the government will do in terms of strategy and funding and resource? And we'll know that probably early in the summer. So we're kind of at this beginning of a government that is really trying to change things and trying to work across all of the departments of government so that every respective area is doing their part. So housing, policing, the family court, the criminal justice system, but also our child maintenance service, the kinds of things that you would want to see happening across. And there's a lot to do in all of those areas. And so that is exciting in terms of, I feel like that's, in the years that I've worked, it feels like some of these issues kind of get picked up and put down, or there's one initiative. And once we're done with that, sometimes politicians tend to think, oh, but we've done a bit of that, we've passed that bit of legislation, and so I think this will help us, I think, have a much more momentum and maintained focus. So that makes me excited for sure.
It's definitely rare that you see in any political landscape violence against women be at the center of what initiatives they hope to focus on. I think often it gets swept up with women's rights issues as a whole and then forgotten as they focus on different issues that affect women, ones that are typically less controversial to focus on or easier to focus on. So it's really an incredible step, I think, in the right direction. And I don't think it sounds too ambitious because if it is a central initiative, it is possible to see a lot more change. So this commission seems like the best place to start. If you could talk about in today's discussions that center on the role of technology in domestic and sexual abuse, technology can serve as a tool for both positive change, but also as a mechanism of perpetrating harm. Can you talk about how you view those contrasting aspects?
Yeah, sure. I think what we've often debated here is like when we say technology, all of us can go to so many differing things. We go to AI or images, indecent images. There's such a range of things, but I think one of the things we're trying to be focused and ask our government to focus on are all of those things for sure, but also kind of the fundamentals in technology. So, do we have our data right? Which I know sounds quite boring, but in a lot of ways, what's holding us back here in the UK is that our data systems, the kind of systems that the police use are not speaking to the ones the courts use versus, and so do we know when orders of protection even exist? Do we have the disaggregated data that tells us how well we're doing in all kinds of ways with, Black minoritized victims or survivors, LGBTQ plus survivors? There's so much that we're missing in terms of like accountability because we don't have some of our basic technology, right? And then with victims and survivors, often the kind of technology that's really pervasive and invasive in their day-to-day life are like, the tracking apps on your phone and just the most common ways that we're using technology. And so there's so much that we need to do to just make sure that we're getting some of those fundamentals right. But then probably the most challenging in the UK is that partly because we have legislation that makes a criminal offense of coercion and controlling behavior. So we've had that since 2015. In the Domestic Abuse Act that created my role, that particular offense was amended so that it's applicable both when you're in the relationship, but when you've left the relationship or post separation. And if you impose that so that is a criminal offense in most areas of England and Wales. Well, England and Wales, Scotland, working on it in Northern Ireland, and so that online is difficult because if you're trying to prove coercive and controlling behavior, what might look as innocent as, just a post, a light, a picture of something that is, the front door of somebody's house, that to just as you're scrolling seems very innocent. But if you're a victim of domestic abuse, that could be like your way of an abuser saying, like, I've found you, I know where you live. How do you then kind of gather evidence from online and offline and really bring the evidence together for some of the offenses that we have in the UK of coercive and controlling behavior? That is getting increasingly complex, and it's hard to I think sometimes what the police do is they think, well, the online related tech facilitated abuse is a little bit complicated, so we'll just police the more obvious offenses. So we have a long way to go to kind of make a lot of kind of our ambitions and our legislation actually make sense in an online world, if that makes sense. And that comes with not just regulating, but it's a lot of work with the police. It's a lot of work with victims and survivors and those who support them to try to make the most of the legislation we have and make it kind of applicable for our day-to-day lives that are using a lot of technology more and more.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion in the space of legislation as a whole that technology is evolving so quickly that it's almost impossible to legislate issues because they come up before you'd even be able to predict them and you can't address them in an efficient amount of time. Do you, in the broader kind of scheme of things, think that there needs to be more massive adjustments to the process in expediting legislation to meet the needs that are constantly evolving of people, particularly victims of domestic abuse?
Yeah, I think there needs to be much. I think of kind of the individual survivor and what their challenge is usually, and it's usually just getting through and getting something done quickly, something taken down quickly or addressed quickly enough. And I just think we don't have those mechanisms at all, even when they're supported by, you know, domestic abuse services or the police even. Often they're having trouble getting through to just having some of those basic actions done. I do think, I think as a society, our level of tolerance, what I'd hope is that our level of tolerance for this is going to change and that we'll expect that we'll maybe only spend our time on, on platforms that will be able and willing to do that more readily. But I think we're not quite at that learning curve as a society to kind of vote with our feet. And I'm hoping in the UK, at least, that Ofcom, the regulator can't do absolutely everything, but once we have regulation in place, I feel we'll have a very good understanding of which tech companies respond to that regulation positively, which, I think there's others who fear that there could just be like, lawsuit after lawsuit about whether the regulation is right or not. I mean, who knows, that may happen, but I think at least it brings out into the open which companies are really doing and addressing issues that we care about. And I know people care about all different kinds of issues, but I suppose something about the regulation that I think is positive beyond just the fines, that can be imposed and that type of thing, is the fact that it gives us so much more information as consumers. And I hope that will, along with the fact that, we have generations growing up online now who I think will be much more savvy than my generation, for example. I think there's a lot of hope that we can get there. I feel like we're living through the kind of Wild West of a lot of these practices, and sadly victims, and particularly women, really do suffer. I mean, it's really clear, the evidence we do have, suffer a lot online in terms of abuse, and whether they're a victim of domestic abuse or just wanting to assert their opinions or have leadership online. There's so many examples. And certainly victims of domestic abuse tell us time and time again how much of the perpetration does extend to that online space.
It's definitely clear that the internet and all of this online access that's at the tip of our fingers has allowed for a lot of interpersonal harm to be perpetrated, especially in situations of domestic abuse or domestic violence. But can you talk about a bit any emerging positive ways that technology has been used to help survivors aside from the Online Safety Act?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that we've had a lot of examples of, particularly during COVID, actually, where technology really did help victims reach out and get the support they needed. When you're in kind of a lockdown environment where you may not want to be heard speaking, the kind of online chat, the kind of ability to do that. I think before COVID, there was always this fear that you could be chatting with, the perpetrator, or somebody might see it. Or I just feel like there was a lot of technology during that time, which helped accelerate a little bit more risk taking about, if people need to reach out, let's find ways to make that happen. So I think that's very good example. And a lot of that has extended, that a lot of that is extended into kind of I don't know, are we in a post-COVID period? I think we must be now, but that has kept, I think, people's use of the kind of devices that do help connect people and feel connected. Like we have quite a few apps, safety related apps, or apps that help to record, reach out for help. There's so many of those that I think are really well done. I'm sure that they're all over the world now, but certainly in the UK we have some really great examples of that. We're starting to use GPS tracking with, making sure that perpetrators of abuse are staying away from areas. So instead of just having, kind of blanket restrictions, having much more technology-based use of, tags, electronic tagging, those types of things in protection orders. I think that's very, very helpful. So there are definitely ways that people connect. I think also just being able to connect online, and victims in rural areas, for example, or just people who feel like it's easier to connect initially to support services or to group work, kind of breaking some of that isolation. So yeah, there's a lot of the kind of tech for good out there, no doubt, and the awareness raising that is done through technology. There's so much that I think we should remind ourselves. You're exactly right, right? To remind ourselves that is happening that we need to embrace and do more of.
It's always good to end on a positive note. There are definitely advantages to technology as much as it's been weaponized as a tool of harm as well. It's something that serves as a community for survivors, a resource hub, and so many other great things as well. It has
Mhm.
been amazing speaking with you. Thank you so much for attending and to everyone, but particularly to Nicole for being here today. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the Tech Summit. Nicole, is there anything you want to leave anybody with?
Oh, I'm just so grateful for the opportunity. Huge congratulations on the Tech Summit. I think it's amazing kind of awareness raising. So much of what No More does is this kind of cross-border bringing or raising awareness of what's going on. So I'm very pleased that I've been able to talk a bit about the UK and, always be in touch. Ray, good luck to you in your next steps. And I'm just really pleased to have been a part. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.